So I would say this is an extremely interesting case, 82-3, recruitment finder's fee. In keeping with the idea of the first BER cases, staying at a rather, I don't know what you would call it. I start in engineering ethics looking at BER cases, looking at things that are not life and death situations. They're not first canon cases that deal with the health, safety, and welfare of the public. We'll get to those. I like to start with cases that point up to the notion of profession and professionalism itself. So we start with things like the earlier cases involving not getting back to a client, involving finagling a free trip disguised as a recruitment opportunity, um, because they go to the idea that as professionals, in the sense of being members of a profession, you're entering into a different thing that might require paying attention to things that other people don't need to pay attention to. I mean, it's always bad business not to get back to a client or customer. But with a professional, it rises to the level of an ethical lapse, you might say. It's probably not a good idea to take advantage of anybody and take advantage of prospective employers to get a trip, but it attains a new importance when the person who's thinking of doing it is a member of a profession. And so, this case, which has to do with the idea of an engineer just recommending other engineers to a recruitment firm and collecting a fee for that, I think that in a lot of jobs, that probably would not be problematic, but within a profession, it is. And that, I think, is the whole point of the case. That is, that within a profession, the idea of giving a recruitment firm or whoever it is names of likely candidates, and if they're hired, collecting some kind of finder's fee. Well, the Board of Ethical Review judges it as being unethical, and it's quite interesting their reasoning why. One of the things that is quite important in any BER case is the references. It's all important, but the references, that is. The idea is that if the BER finds that an engineer has been unethical, or that it would be unethical in this case for an engineer to do something, they've got to be able to point to a part of the code that would be violated. And um, it's quite interesting. They cite section 3-1 3.1.d. Engineer shall not attempt to attract an engineer from another employer by false or misleading pretenses. And they look at different cases that they've, reasoning from different cases that have been decided in the past, and then looking at this case and deciding that if the engineer were to do this, were to suggest names of likely candidates and collect a fee, it would not be under false or misleading pretenses. So it would not be a violation of that particular part of the code. It's the other part that they cite that would seem to be more operative, that an engineer should not promote their own interest at the expense of the dignity and integrity of the profession. So their own interest in this case would be collecting the finder's fee. And then the question really is whether that would be at the expense of the dignity and integrity of the profession. And that points to the heart of the case, which I think they get to here on, I guess, page 3. Or maybe a little bit farther up. There's a couple of key expressions or phrases that, yeah, here on page 2, I start here and say our conclusion in case 68-4 was to the effect that the facts did not warrant a finding of unethical conduct, but we noted that an effort by one engineering firm to attract employees away from their present employer without any indication of interest from those employees, quote, is not in keeping with the desirable professional standards and the proper relationship between firms within the profession. That is, that uh, it just doesn't seem, it's not keeping with professional standards for engineering firms to openly compete with each other for employees. That may sound a little strange, but if you see that their reasoning there, it kind of makes sense within a profession. And the next paragraph gives you a little more. We further commented in that case that this type of activity should be judged under a concept of professional courtesy. We don't treat other engineering firms and other engineers uh, as we're all members of a profession, so there's a kind of a fellowship here, which doesn't mean that they aren't to a certain degree business competitors, but you simply cannot treat other members of the profession uh, as simply business competitors. You're members of the same profession. You have a common identity, bond, and goal, which is to serve the human race technologically, right? So, in that common aspiration and that common goal, you simply can't treat other members of the profession as business competitors only. You just can't do it, is the idea. So, uh, yes. So, about this case, they say we continue to look with disfavor on a procedure that lends itself to a less than professional approach. And the less than professional approach is to actively try to induce engineers to change their positions to get them to jump ship and move to another company. What they say is that it's perfectly, of course, engineers have the right to do so, but the key point is that the impetus should come from them and not from another party. That is, the idea is that if a professional wants to change jobs, change their situation, that's absolutely fine. And they have the absolute right to do so. But it's not fine for third parties to try to entice them to do so. If you understand that distinction, it's actually quite important. As they say, we recognize the competitive aspects of personnel recruitment among firms, but nevertheless adhere to our view that a proper professional relationship calls for a change in employment initiative to come from the employee, that is, from the engineer, and that such decisions not be the subject of outside inducements or the tawdry case 82-3 use of financial bonuses to those who engage in a form of flesh peddling for monetary gain. This really goes to some pretty ancient, original aspects of profession and professionalism in general. That is, that there is a sense in which, no matter what your gender, you are entering into a profession. And one of the original ideas of the profession is that every member is a gentleman. And that there are certain things that gentlemen just don't do. And flesh peddling, which basically just means, you know, actively trying to get somebody to work for somebody else using monetary inducements is just not something that gentlemen do. I think that really does kind of come down to that. So the last paragraph of the discussion: for engineer A to be a party to this kind of arrangement for monetary benefit could constitute an act on his part for his own interest, sure. Whether that act would be at the expense of the dignity and integrity of the profession, which is, what's left to decide, may be in the gray area. Like, it's not clear that doing this would really tarnish the profession, but we think that the ulterior motive, which is monetary gain, coupled with what is at best a questionable practice, would tend to expose the engineering profession to an unfortunate perception. And what would be that unfortunate perception that outsiders might have? That its members are willing to sacrifice the principles noted above for a selfish gain, and thereby create an image of participation in a form of flesh peddling, whereby engineers are treated as objects rather than on their own professional merits, and who are motivated by their own initiatives as to employment opportunities. So it's okay for professionals to change their jobs, but that the motivation for that has to come from them. If we're in a situation where we're just buying and selling engineers, then it reduces their dignity, is the idea. Now, this may be kind of old-fashioned ideas, but the idea of a profession is an old-fashioned idea. And I think one of the things that comes out of this, if we sort of cut through a lot of the reasoning, which is good reasoning, I think, but what motivates the reasoning? Well, there's some things that professionals don't do. And one thing they don't do is they don't accept money for providing names for recruitment, because that is not in keeping with the very ancient traditional notions of what a professional is.